In section 1.4, we're going to look at inequalities. So inequality is less than, greater than, less than or equal, greater than or equal. And we're also going to look at how to put our inequality in an interval. So using parentheses or bracket, and so that's kind of like my parenthesis, number, comma, number, parenthesis. And so that's what that's explaining. Parentheses or bracket, the start and end, and then behind it, you put another parenthesis or bracket to close it. So those are intervals. And then we're going to graph on a number line. So let's look at that. So our inequalities are kind of at the top. So we're first going to look at greater than or less than, those first two columns. So x is less than 3. So let's graph that. So I'm going to put my number line. And then you can put your 3. You really don't need to put any other numbers around it. We know which way is smaller and larger. So if the mouth is opening up to the 3, so it always goes to the bigger number, then we are going to shade to the left, right? The smaller, x is smaller than 3. So shade to the left. Because you kind of remember the mouth opens up to the bigger number. So 3 in this case is the largest number. So that means everything else is going to be smaller. So with a normal greater than or less than sign, so no number under it, that means it's going to be our parentheses. So put a parentheses on the 3 and then shade it. And then our interval is kind of our plotting points, right? You remember this in geometry with the parentheses and the two numbers inside separated by a comma. So in this case, we only have one endpoint, the 3, but the shading is going forever towards the negative infinity. So it's going forever and ever and ever towards those negatives. So for the interval, you always list the start point and end point, or the smallest, comma, largest number. So obviously negative infinity is smaller than 3, so I'm going to list that first in my interval. And right now, because it is a greater than or less than, we are going to deal with parentheses. Infinities can only hold parentheses. Infinities can only hold parentheses. And then so that number is listed first, the negative infinity, comma, the 3 is the largest, and so you put a parentheses behind that. So now let's look at our greater than or equal to, less than or equal to numbers. So that is our inequalities with the line underneath. So I have my first equation, the 3 and 5. So I'm going to graph that. So make a number line. So I'm going to put 3 on one side and 5 on the other. So deciding on what has a parenthesis or bracket, let's look back at our equation. So that 3, what's touching it? A plane less than or equal to, so that means that's going to be just a parenthesis. Now what's touching the 5? So that one has the line underneath, so those are the brackets. So these regular ones, those are parentheses, and then the ones with the line underneath, you're going to have the brackets, and then shade in between. So our x is somewheres in between 3 and 5. And then at the underneath, you can see the start and end point, or the smallest number, comma, the largest number. So always list the smallest first, so 3, comma, 5. And 3 had that parenthesis, and then 5 has a bracket. And they can be different, that's okay. So let's look at some more examples. So for number 1, let's write -2, 9 as an inequality. and graph it. So I'm going to list -2, I have my x, and then I have my 9. So we need to look at, okay, is that a parentheses or bracket? It's a bracket, so I know that's going to have my extra line underneath. And then 9, what's touching that one? Is it going to be parenthesis or bracket? It's a bracket, so that means I have that extra line underneath. So that's my inequality. So let's graph it. Put your -2 on one side and +9 on the other. And again, those are both brackets. So I'm going to put a bracket above each number and then shade in between. So write x is less than -3 as an interval and graph it. So I like graphing first so I can see which way it's shaded to put my -infinity or +infinity. So it's easier for me. So let's graph it. So put -3 on your number line. Now the mouth is opening up to which number? The -3. So that means that -3 is the largest number. So I know I'm going to shade towards the smaller. Now, am I going to put a parenthesis or bracket above the -3? Well, it doesn't have that extra line, so it's a parenthesis. So let's write our interval. So which way am I shading? I am shading towards the -infinity. So -infinity is smaller than -3. So I'm going to write that first, -infinity, comma, -3. So now let's decide parentheses or brackets. Your infinity sign only has a parenthesis, so you don't even have to think about that one. Infinity signs cannot have brackets. So now let's look at the -3. It is a parenthesis because it does not have that extra line underneath. All right, so let's look at number 3. So it's telling us we need to solve this problem and then do the interval and then graph it. So we need to get x by itself. So divide -5 on both sides. On that left side, it cancels. Now, this is the special case with these. If you divide or multiply by a negative number, the sign flips. If you divide or multiply by a negative number, the sign flips. Well, we divided by -5. So our sign is going to switch sides. So 15 divided by -5, that's going to be -3. So that's the only rule when solving inequalities. Other than that, you pretty much can treat it like an equal sign and do our same steps. But if you're at the end and you divide or multiply by a negative number, your sign is going to flip sides. All right, so let's graph it. I like graphing first. So put your number line, put your -3. Now look at our inequality. The mouth is opening up to the x, so that means the x is the largest number. So -3 is the smallest. So I'm going to shade towards the larger. And then is that going to be a parentheses or bracket? Well, let's look at our inequality. It has that line underneath, so that means it's going to be our bracket. That extra line is the brackets. All right, so let's do our interval. Which way is it shading? Is it shading towards the -infinity or the +infinity? It's going towards the +infinity. So I need to list my smallest number times my smallest number first, comma, largest number. So -3 is the smallest, comma, +infinity. Now -3, did that have a parenthesis or a bracket? It had a bracket. And then the infinity. Infinities can only hold a parenthesis.